history records the deafening roar of the Ottoman cannons that crumbled the walls of Constantinople. Yet, in the sweltering summer of 1462, the world's mightiest army was brought to its knees not by the thunder of war, but by a silence. A silence so unnatural, reeking of death and iron, that it froze the very soul of Sultan Mehmed II. We are often taught that Vlad the Impaler was merely a sadist, a cartoonish monster of folklore, but lurking beneath that myth is a darkness far more terrifying. The story of a broken hostage who weaponized his own trauma to dismantle an empire's mind, using the most grotesque architecture ever conceived. Before we descend into this abyss, gently press the like button if you possess the courage to look, and whisper in the comments from which city you are watching the shadows tonight. To understand the architecture of the nightmare that would later consume Wallachia, one must not look at the man of 30, but at the boy of 11. The year was 1442, a time when the world was carved up by blade and belief. Young Vlad, along with his younger brother Radu, was not merely sent away from home. They were traded, exchanged like cattle in a cold, political transaction by their own father, Vlad Dracul, to secure a fragile peace with the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II. Imagine, if you can, the sensory overload of a child torn from the cold, grey forests of the Carpathian Mountains and thrust into the humid, opulent heat of Anatolia. They were held at the fortress of Erigos, a place that history often mistakes for a prison. It was not a dungeon in the traditional sense. It was something far more insidious. It was a gilded cage, draped in silk and scented with exotic spices, where the threat of death was served alongside every meal. This brings us to a crucial piece of context that is often omitted from the sanitized textbooks. The Ottomans did not intend to torture these boys physically. Their goal was psychological re-engineering. This was part of a sophisticated imperial strategy known as the Devsham system logic, where the sons of conquered lands were raised to be more Ottoman than the Ottomans themselves, or Radu, the younger and more pliable brother, succumbed to this seduction, eventually becoming a favorite of the court. But Vlad was made of something more brittle, something that would not bend, but would instead sharpen. For 6 agonizing years, Vlad became a silent observer in the Sultan's court. But what did he see? He didn't see merely the administration of an empire. He witnessed the supreme efficacy of terror as a governing tool. It is recorded in Ottoman chronicles that the young prince was often stubborn, earning him the whip. But I would argue that he was not merely being stubborn. He was studying. He watched as the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops, moved with a discipline that stripped them of their humanity, turning them into perfect instruments of the state. He observed public executions that were not conducted in anger, but with the cold, bureaucratic precision of a clerk filing a document. He learned that in the eyes of the Sultan, a human life had no intrinsic value. Its only value lay in what its destruction could achieve. If impaling one traitor could ensure the obedience of 1,000 villages, then the act was not cruelty. It was mathematics. It was here, in the shadow of the crescent moon, that the seeds of the forest of the Impaled were truly sown. Vlad realized that he would never have the vast armies of the East, nor the infinite gold of the West. If he were ever to rule, he would need a weapon that cost nothing but flesh and blood. He would need to become a nightmare so vivid that it would paralyze his enemies before they even drew their swords. In 1448, the news arrived. His father had been assassinated, neutralized by the treacherous boyars, the local nobility of Wallachia, and his older brother, Mircea, had suffered a fate that would haunt Vlad's waking hours forever. Mircea was not just killed, he was buried alive, left to claw at the dirt in his final, suffocating moments. When the Ottomans finally released Vlad to claim his throne, they believed they were unleashing a puppet, a broken boy who would bow to their will. They were wrong. They had not broken him. They had forged him. They had taken a frightened child and, through years of cold observation, turned him into a mirror that would soon reflect their own brutality back at them with a magnitude they could never have anticipated. The education was complete. The monster had graduated, and he was going home. Easter Sunday, 1457, in the great hall of Târgoviște. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, heavy wine, and the sweet, cloying aroma of beeswax candles. It was supposed to be a celebration of resurrection, but for the nobility of Wallachia, it would become a requiem. Imagine you are one of them. Let us call you Albu, a high-ranking boyar. You sit at the long wooden table, draped in your finest velvet, the fabric scratching slightly against your skin in the heat of the hall. You look around at your peers, 500 of the most powerful men and women in the principality. You feel secure. After all, you are the kingmakers. Princes come and go like the seasons, often by your design, but the boyars remain. You look at the young Prince Vlad at the head of the table. He seems pale, quiet, perhaps even submissive. You raise your goblet, unaware that the wine you are drinking will be the last comfort you ever taste. The conversation is loud, boisterous. Then, Vlad stands. He does not shout. He merely raises a hand, and the hall falls into an uneasy silence. He asks a question, his voice calm, almost curious. How many princes have you survived? The boyars, drunk on their own arrogance, begin to boast. One laughs and says he has seen 7 rulers. Another claims 12. They are listing the reigns they have outlasted as if they were trophies, failing to realize that with every number. They are confessing to treason. They are admitting that they are the cancer that has kept Wallachia weak, the architects of the revolving door of assassinations that killed Vlad's father and buried his brother alive. Vlad nods, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. Then, he gives a signal. The doors to the hall are not opened. They are barred. The transition from a feast to a slaughterhouse is instantaneous. The king's guard, loyal only to Vlad, descends upon the room. We will not dwell on the gore, for the imagination is far more vivid than any description. Instead, focus on the sounds, the crashing of heavy silver platters against the stone floor, the sudden, sharp intake of breath that precedes a scream, the overturning of tables, sending the Easter feast sprawling into the dirt. The older boyars, those deemed too set in their treacherous ways to be useful, were neutralized on the spot. History tells us they were impaled beyond the city walls, their bodies left as grim warnings to any who would question the prince's authority. But for the younger, stronger nobles and their wives, a different fate awaited. A fate that many would soon come to regard as worse than death. Stripped of their finery, their velvet and silk replaced by the cold bite of the wind, they were placed in chains. This was the beginning of the Poenari March. Vlad did not simply want them dead. He wanted to repurpose them. He forced this once proud nobility to march 50 miles north, up the rugged, unforgiving canyon of the Argeș River. Their destination was the ruins of an ancient fortress on a mountain top, a place that Vlad intended to turn into his impregnable eagle's nest, Castle Poenari. The construction of Poenari is a testament to the limits of human endurance. For months, these nobles, people who had never lifted anything heavier than a sword or a goblet, were forced to haul massive stones up the sheer cliffs. The primary sources describe a scene of wretched transformation. Their expensive clothes, the symbols of their status, literally rotted off their bodies in the rain and sweat. Their skin turned to leather, their hands to raw meat. They worked until they expired, and when one fell, the line did not stop. The body was simply pushed into the abyss below, and the work continued. This was Vlad's sandwich of terror and pragmatism on one layer. It was a brutal punishment for the betrayal of his family. On the other, it was a strategic necessity. He needed a fortress that the Ottomans could not reach, and he needed to break the power of the boyars to centralize the state. By the time the castle was finished, the old social order of Wallachia had ceased to exist. In its place stood a new hierarchy, one where birthright meant nothing and loyalty to Vlad meant everything. The message was clear, written in the stone and mortar of Puenari, mixed, as the legends say, with the blood of the aristocracy. There is no power in Wallachia but mine. By 1459, the silence from Wallachia had become deafening in Constantinople. The annual tribute of golden children, the blood tax that vassal states were required to pay to the Ottoman Empire, had stopped. Vlad was not merely ignoring the debt, he was ghosting an empire. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had brought the Byzantine walls to dust, was not accustomed to being ignored by a minor prince in a backwater province. He sent envoys, high-ranking diplomats dressed in the finest silks and turbans, to Târgoviște. Their mission was clear: remind the dragon's son of his place. The arrival of these envoys at Vlad's court is one of the most chilling scenes in diplomatic history. It plays out not like a political meeting, but like a piece of dark theatre where only one actor knows the script. The envoys entered the throne room, bowing, but they kept their turbans firmly on their heads. And now, we must pause here to sandwich this moment with necessary context. In the Ottoman tradition, the turban was not merely a hat, it was a religious signifier, a mark of a man's submission to God, and removing it in public was unthinkable. However, in the Christian courts of Europe, refusing to remove one's headgear in the presence of a monarch was a grave insult, a direct challenge to his authority. Vlad, who had spent his youth in the Ottoman court, knew this perfectly well. He understood their custom better than they understood his, but he saw an opportunity, a chance to turn a cultural misunderstanding into a geopolitical statement. He asked them, with a voice that sources describe as terrifyingly polite, why they insulted him by remaining covered. The lead envoy, confident in the might of the Sultan backing him, explained that it was the custom of their people. Vlad smiled, that same thin, humorless smile. I have no wish to make you break your customs. He reportedly said, in fact, I wish to help you strengthen them, so that you may never break them again. He gestured to his guards. They did not draw swords. They produced hammers and long iron nails. What followed was a perversion of diplomacy that still echoes through the centuries. The envoys were held down. They were not killed. That would have been too simple, too merciful. Vlad ordered the guards to nail the turbans directly to their skulls. Thud, thud, thud. Close your eyes and imagine that sound. The rhythmic, dull impact of iron striking iron, then bone, echoing off the stone walls of the throne room. There were no battle cries, no clash of armies, just the methodical sound of carpentry applied to human beings. The genius of this cruelty lay in its medical precision. The nails were driven in such a way that the men did not expire immediately. They remained conscious, trapped in a twilight of agony, their customs now permanently fused to their flesh. Vlad then sent them back to Constantinople. Picture that journey. Days of riding under the scorching sun, the metal heating up, the pain radiating with every hoofbeat. When they finally stumbled into the Sultan's court, they were not just failed diplomats. They were living, breathing messages. They were a grotesque billboard that read, I do not fear you. When Mehmed II saw his envoys, men he had sent in arrogance, now returned as broken, disfigured shells. The primary sources tell us he did not rage. Not immediately. He went silent. Târgoviște, the Ottoman historian, notes that the Sultan was amazed by the sheer audacity of the act. In that moment, the dynamic shifted. Mehmed realized that Vlad was not a rebellious vassal to be disciplined. He was a rabid wolf that needed to be put down. The sandwich was complete. Vlad had used a diplomatic technicality to justify an atrocity, which in turn forced the Ottoman Empire into a full-scale invasion. War was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability. But as Mehmed began to assemble his army, a force of nearly 90,000 men, one of the largest invasion forces the world had ever seen, he made a critical error. He assumed he was marching to fight a conventional war against a conventional king. He did not know that he was marching into a trap. A trap where the land itself would turn against him, where the water would burn, and where the night would develop teeth. The envoys were just the prologue. The true horror was waiting in the shadows of the Danube. The Ottoman army that crossed the Danube was a leviathan, 90,000 men, a moving city of steel and silk that stretched for miles, capable of crushing kingdoms simply by walking over them. But as they marched deeper into Wallachia, they found themselves fighting a war that did not exist in any military manual. Vlad did not field an army to meet them. He gave them nothing. He gave them the void. This is the strategy known to historians as scorched earth. But Vlad took it to a biblical extreme. He burned his own villages to the ground. He poisoned his own wells. He ordered his people to take their livestock and vanish into the Carpathian forests. The Ottomans marched through a dead landscape, a grey wasteland where the only thing that grew was hunger. Imagine you are an Ottoman soldier in this column. It is June, 1462. The heat is suffocating. Your canteen is empty because the last well you found was filled with rotting carcasses. You are the predator, yet you feel like prey. And then, the sun goes down. Night in Wallachia was not a time for rest. It was when the ghosts arrived. Vlad's men, disguised in Ottoman uniforms, fluent in Turkish thanks to Vlad's own education, would slip into the camps. They would not engage in open combat. They would slit a throat here, set a fire there, and vanish before the alarm could be raised. They were psychological parasites, eating away at the sanity of the invaders. But these were just skirmishes. The true masterpiece of terror was unleashed on the night of June 17th. The night attack at Târgoviște remains one of the most audacious military operations in human history. Vlad, with a small force of perhaps 10,000 men, decided to do the unthinkable. He would not attack the army. He would assassinate the Sultan in the middle of his own camp. The primary sources describe the scene as a descent into absolute bedlam. Under the cover of a pitch-black night, Vlad's cavalry burst into the Ottoman encampment. They carried torches, not to see, but to burn. They blew bugles to create the sonic illusion of a massive army. Picture the confusion. You jolt awake to the sound of screaming horses and the smell of burning canvas. Smoke stings your eyes. You see figures running, shouting orders in Turkish. Your language. You strike out, only to realize too late that you have cut down your own brother. The Wallachians were everywhere and nowhere, a fluid force of destruction that moved through the camp like a scythe through wheat. At the center of this storm rode Vlad himself. He was not leading from the back. He was a spear tip, cutting a path directly toward the Sultan's imperial pavilion. This was the calculated madness. Vlad knew he couldn't kill 90,000 men, but he knew that if he could cut off the head of the snake, if he could kill the shadow of God on earth in his own bed, the body would die. The empire would panic and retreat. He came terrifyingly close. Historians debate the exact details, but it is generally agreed that Vlad mistook the tent of the Grand Vizier for that of the Sultan. He shredded the wrong tent. By the time the mistake was realized, the elite janissaries had formed a defensive ring around Mehmed, realizing the moment had passed. Vlad did not throw his men away in a suicidal last stand. He signaled a retreat. As quickly as they had appeared, the Wallachians melted back into the dark forest, leaving behind thousands of dead Ottomans, many killed by friendly fire in the panic. The sun rose on a devastated camp. The physical casualties were significant, but the psychological damage was terminal. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, surrounded by the greatest army on earth, had nearly been murdered in his pajamas by a vassal prince. The invincibility of the Ottoman war machine had been shattered. The soldiers were no longer just hungry and thirsty. They were paranoid. Every shadow looked like an assassin. Every rustle in the bushes sounded like death. They refused to sleep. And an army that cannot sleep is an army that is already defeated. Mehmed II, shaken but furious, ordered the march to continue toward the capital, Târgoviște. He believed that capturing the city would end this nightmare. He believed the worst was over. He was wrong. The night attack was merely the opening act. Vlad knew the Ottomans were still coming, and he knew he had one final card to play. He had prepared a welcome gift outside the capital, an installation of such profound horror that it would stop the invasion not with swords, but with sight. The psychological breaking point was just over the horizon. The road to Târgoviște should have been the final glory of the Ottoman campaign. The night attack had failed to kill the Sultan, and the mighty Ottoman war machine, though shaken, was still intact. They marched forward, expecting a siege, expecting walls to breach and gates to batter. But as they rounded the final hills approaching the capital, the scouts stopped. Then the vanguard stopped. Then the silence rippled backward through the ranks like a contagion, until 90,000 men stood perfectly still. It wasn't what they saw. Not at first. It was what they smelled. The summer heat of June had been baking the valley for weeks. The air was heavy, not just with the metallic tang of ozone, but with a scent so thick, so sweet and putrid, that it coated the back of the throat like oil. It was the scent of a mass grave, open to the sun. As the Sultan rode forward to see what had halted his army, the horror revealed itself, stretching out before them, covering an area of nearly 7 acres, a space large enough to hold the entire city of Târgoviște itself. Was a forest, but the trees had been stripped of their branches, and upon these trees hung the fruit of Vlad's labor. 20,000 bodies. Let that number sink in. 20,000. This was not a battlefield. This was an installation, a tableau of suffering arranged with the obsessive precision of a maniacal engineer. The bodies were not piled randomly. They were organized. The Greek historian Laonikos Chalkokondyles, the primary eyewitness whose account chills us to this day, described a scene of geometric horror. The stakes were arranged in concentric circles, creating patterns that could only be fully appreciated from the sky or by God. The height of the stakes varied according to rank. Peasants and common soldiers were impaled on lower stakes, closer to the ground, creating a carpet of death. The officers, the nobles, and the commanders were elevated higher, floating above their subordinates even in death. And at the very center, on the tallest stake of all, plated with gold to catch the sun, was Hamza Pasha, the Ottoman commander captured months earlier. He was dressed in his full ceremonial silk robes, preserved in his final moment of agony, staring eternally down the road toward the Sultan he had failed to serve. The sensory rule here dictates that we look beyond the gore. The true horror was the stillness. 20,000 people, suspended in the air. Yet there was no sound but the flapping of carrion birds and the wind whistling through the dry timber. Infants were impaled alongside their mothers, Entire families were preserved together in a grotesque parody of domestic life. But here is the most terrifying detail, the one that truly breaks the mind: the preservation. Vlad had staged this weeks in advance. He had calculated the rate of decomposition. He had ensured that when the Sultan arrived, the forest would be at its most visually impactful stage. Some victims were skeletons, others were bloated and black, and some, according to the whispers of the soldiers, were still twitching. The final nerves firing in bodies that had long since forgotten how to live. The psychological impact on the Ottoman army was catastrophic. These were men who had stormed the walls of Constantinople. They had waded through rivers of blood. They were not strangers to death. But this was not war. This was something else. This was a violation of the natural order so profound that it made their swords feel useless. How do you fight an enemy who treats the human body like clay? How do you conquer a land that hates you so much it turns its own people into a barricade of rotting flesh? Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, the man who believed he was the shadow of God on earth, rode to the edge of this forest. He looked at Hamza Pasha. He looked at the miles of death stretching to the horizon. He did not vomit. He did not scream. He simply stared. And then he said the words that have been immortalized by Chalker condyles, words that reveal the ultimate success of Vlad's psychological warfare. The Sultan reportedly whispered, "How can I despoil a man who does such great deeds? A man who knows how to govern his subjects and his power in this way is worthy of much." It was a twisted form of admiration. Mehmed recognized a kindred spirit, a fellow architect of absolute power, but one who was willing to go further than even he dared. He realized that to take Târgoviște, he would have to march his men through this forest. He would have to force them to brush against the rotting limbs of their comrades. And he knew, in that moment, that his army would break, not from fear of death, but from fear of becoming part of the art. The sandwich of history closes here. Vlad did not defeat the Ottoman army with superior tactics or better weapons. He defeated them with a single, massive injection of trauma. Mehmed turned his horse around. He ordered a general retreat. The most powerful army in the world turned its back on a tiny principality. Defeated by the sight of what one man was capable of doing, Vlad the Impaler had won. But as the Ottomans retreated, leaving the forest of the Impaled to the vultures, a new question began to rise like the smoke from the ruined villages. Vlad had saved his country. But in the process, what had he become? And could a man who had built such a monument to suffering ever truly return to the world of the living? The story of Vlad does not end with a triumph. It ends, as all tragedies do, with betrayal. The very people he fought to protect, the Wallachian boyars and the Hungarian king, eventually turned on him. He was imprisoned, exiled, and finally killed in battle in 1476. History has a cruel sense of irony. The man who defined his life by the stake met his end by the blade. His head was severed, preserved in a jar of honey to stop the rot, and sent to Constantinople. There, Sultan Mehmed II displayed it on a high stake above the city gates. The architect of the forest had finally become one of his own trees. But while his body perished, the shadow he cast did not. We tell ourselves stories about vampires and supernatural monsters because the truth is too uncomfortable to bear. It is easier to believe that Vlad was a demon than to accept that he was a human being. A man who looked at the world with absolute clarity and decided that terror was the only language it understood. The forest of rotting corpses has long since turned to dust. The stakes have rotted away, but the question remains. Hanging in the dark like smoke, if you were stripped of everything, if you were forced to watch your world burn, and if you held the hammer in your hand, are you certain, absolutely certain, that you wouldn't build a forest of your own? Sleep well.